Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Bustamante. Today we're going to talk about 2.6, which is membrane transport, and we're going to talk about 2.7, which is facilitated diffusion. Basically, we're going to talk about how molecules can move in and out of the cell through the cell membrane and the mechanism by which they go ahead and do that. Before we do that, though, it's important to know about something called a concentration gradient. And when we talk about a concentration gradient, we're really just comparing two or maybe more sides, but typically two sides. We're going to talk about a side that's high concentration versus a side that's low concentration. And when we do that, we need to remember that we're always talking about one in reference to another. So sometimes when we just talk about concentration, what are we really talking about? Well, we're really talking about the idea of how much solute typically is in our solution. So solute, I like to think of as kind of the stuff, right? If we look at these two containers, you could have ions. They have ions of chlorine and ions of potassium in them. Okay, so those little molecules that are inside, say, our water, that is our solute. Our solute is our stuff, and our solvent is the liquid that they're in. Typically, our solvent in most instances is water or something. So when we say a high concentration, typically we're talking about the amount of solute that is in our solution. So you might look at these two compartments in our first picture here, and you might say compartment A has a higher concentration of solute than compartment B does, because you can see that there's more particles inside A than there are inside B, and there's less space between them. Okay, so we would say side A has a higher concentration, side B has a lower concentration. If we look at this picture here, we start to see that they're more spread out, right? They're starting to look more even. And then when we look very down at the bottom, we see that those particles are pretty evenly spread out between the two compartments. And this is a result, I guess you could say, of this idea of our selective membrane, right? It allows some things through and some things not to move through. That's how we're able to build up these concentrations of one side being more concentrated or less concentrated, because only some things can get through. But because some of the particles can move through, depending on what that particle is, right? If it's nonpolar, if it's small, just through our cell membrane, it can typically move through, right? Over time, we'll see them diffuse out to being equal. We can also think about it like dropping some sort of dye into water, right? Over time, that dye will spread out and be equal. So that's our idea of concentration gradient, and that's what we have to understand in order to understand how molecules can move through and why they move through in a certain direction. So there are two main types of transport. The first we're going to talk about today is passive transport. And passive transport just means that we have a net movement of molecules from what we say are our high concentration to our low concentration. And because they're moving from our high concentration to our low concentration, there's no energy required. Molecules want to spread out and be equal and even. That means we do not require ATP, or there's no energy required for passive transport. Passive just means to kind of like hang out and do nothing, and that's kind of what passive transport is doing, right? Don't need to add any energy, but it really plays a primary role in molecules moving back and forth across the cell membrane. What are some types of passive transport? Well, the first type of passive transport is just diffusion. And it's where we can see small nonpolar molecules just move through the membrane typically from a high concentration to a low concentration. They could move into the membrane that way or out of the membrane, either way. And then we're going to talk about facilitated diffusion, which is basically just diffusion through some sort of a channel, some sort of a protein that has a space for those particles to move through. So what are those types of passive transport? Well, the first type is just diffusion, and diffusion can happen across a membrane for nonpolar and small molecules. Some water molecules actually can diffuse directly through the cell membrane too. They're going to go from the high concentration to the low concentration and spread out equally, but not as many. An important thing to remember with diffusion and molecules moving through is that even when they say they look equal or they look even, it's not that those particles stop moving. Those particles are always moving and passing back and forth through the cell membrane and transferring from one location to another. We just say that the net or the overall movement is equal in both directions when we hit something called equilibrium, when they're the same on both sides. We can also, though, have facilitated diffusion, and facilitated diffusion is just diffusion, like we just saw, high to low concentration, but it has to go through a channel protein. It looks kind of like this, a channel protein, right? And it has some sort of a hole in it. It's typically very specific. It will only let certain specific molecules pass through it. It's designed for a certain molecule, but it still goes from high to low concentration, and it does not require any energy. So what requires a protein to help it pass through or facilitated diffusion? Typically, large and charged molecules need some sort of protein in order to pass through. Some examples of this: sodium, potassium, and we're going to talk about something called aquaporins. Aquaporins. And aquaporins just allow lots of water to go through. Sometimes there are conformational or shape changes that occur here, but still the main thing is that there's no energy required for any type of passive transport. So what's an aquaporin? Well, an aquaporin is really just a special transport that allows water to go through, right? We did see that some water can pass through the membrane, but let's just say it's only like about 5% or so. And a cell needs a lot more than 5% water passage, right? Lots of water needs to come in and maybe out. So we have these special protein channels that allow lots of water to go through. They're made just for water. It's called an aquaporin. And here's a real life aquaporin as a 3D model, because remember when we're looking and talking about these proteins, they have primary, their amino acid structure, secondary, how they fold into your alpha helices and beta sheaths, and then your tertiary structure and even your quaternary structure if it's more than one protein. These little red things, they are your water molecules passing through that channel protein there. But I think that's a nice image because it allows us to see that it's actually three-dimensional and how that is put together.